She was bleeding, half buried in snow and lying just outside a quiet mechanic's garage during a blinding storm. He didn't know her name, where she came from, or why she whispered, "No hospital," before passing out again. But what started as a simple act of kindness would uncover secrets that could bring down a billion-dollar empire. If you're new to the channel, make sure to subscribe, like the video, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Now let's jump into the story. The snow was falling harder than it had all winter. Big flakes, heavy and wet, dropped from the sky like slow-motion feathers. The streets were already buried in white, and most shops in town had closed early. But inside a small auto garage on the edge of Maple Hill, one man was still working. Noah Weller wiped grease from his hands with a rag that looked like it had already fought 3 wars. He was tired, his fingers aching from hours spent under the hood of a dented old minivan. The customer had left not 5 minutes earlier, grumbling the whole time about prices as if Noah had personally invented inflation. The garage was quiet now, except for the low hum of a space heater buzzing in the corner. Noah exhaled slowly, his breath hanging in the cold air like smoke. It was time to lock up and go home. He walked toward the front door, ready to turn off the lights, when something made him stop. A shadow moved just outside, barely visible beneath the overhang where the snow met the pavement. At first he thought it was a trash bag blown by the wind, but then it moved again. Noah narrowed his eyes, stepped outside, and felt the icy wind slap his face. That wasn't a trash bag. It was a person. A girl. She was lying in the snow, curled on her side like someone had dropped her from the sky. Her coat was ripped, soaked through, and blood had painted a dark patch across her shoulder. Her legs were drawn up under her like she had fallen mid-run and never got back up. Noah's heart kicked into gear. "Hey!" he called out, but she didn't move. He dropped to his knees beside her, snow soaking into his jeans. Her face was pale, too pale, and a cut above her eyebrow had frozen over with blood. He reached for her wrist. Her pulse was faint, but it was there. Without another thought, he scooped her into his arms. She was lighter than expected, like she hadn't eaten in days. Her head lolled against his chest as he carried her into the garage, kicking the door closed behind him. Inside, he laid her gently on the old leather couch near the heater. He wrapped her in a spare blanket and ran to grab his first aid kit from the workbench. The cut on her head wasn't too deep, but the wound on her side, just under her ribs, was bad. Jagged, maybe from metal, maybe glass. He didn't know. But he cleaned it as best he could, his hands steady despite the panic creeping into his chest. She moaned softly, eyes fluttering open just for a moment. No hospital," she whispered, voice barely more than a breath. "What?" Noah leaned in. "No hospital. Please," she repeated, and her eyes closed again. Noah hesitated. Everything in him told him to call for help, but he checked his phone. No signal. The landline? Dead. The storm had knocked out the tower lines again, just like last year. He looked back at her, curled under the blanket like a wounded bird. There was fear in her voice. Real fear. Not just pain, not just injury. Something deeper. "Okay," he whispered, more to himself than to her. "No hospital. You're safe here." He pulled another blanket over her and placed a warm water bottle by her hands. Then he sat nearby, watching her chest rise and fall, slow and shallow. Time moved strangely after that. Minutes melted into hours. The storm outside howled like a wounded beast, but inside the garage was quiet, warm. He brewed some tea on the old hot plate, spooning a few drops into her mouth when she stirred. She didn't wake, but her breathing stayed steady. Noah didn't know who she was, didn't know where she'd come from or what had happened to her. But none of that mattered in the moment, because here she was, and he was all she had. As midnight approached, Noah leaned back in a worn-out armchair, arms crossed tightly over his chest. He stared at the couch where the girl slept, her body bundled in layers of warmth, her skin still too pale. Whatever had brought her here, whatever she was running from, it didn't matter right now. What mattered was that she'd found this place, found him, and until she could stand again, until she could speak and walk and tell her story, he would watch over her, not because he had to, not because it was expected, but because something deep in his bones, something stubborn and decent, told him this was the right thing to do. Outside, the snowstorm showed no signs of stopping. But inside that little garage, something else had started. Something fragile. Something human. Morning arrived slowly. Pale light pushed through the frosted windows, soft and hazy. Inside the garage, it was quiet, except for the buzz of the old space heater and the occasional creak of metal cooling down. Noah Weller hadn't slept much. He'd spent most of the night checking on the girl, making sure her breathing stayed steady, adjusting her blankets and waiting for her to wake up. He sipped cold tea from a chipped mug, his eyes heavy but his mind alert. She stirred just as the clock hit 7:12. A small gasp escaped her lips, and her eyes blinked open. She looked around, confused. Her gaze darted across the room, searching for something familiar, something safe. "It's okay," Noah said gently from the chair. "You're safe." She flinched at the sound of his voice, then held her side and winced in pain. Slowly, she sat up. "Where am I?" she whispered. "My garage. I found you outside in the snow. You were hurt." The girl looked down at the blankets wrapped around her, then at the couch beneath her. "You brought me in?" Noah nodded. "Didn't have much of a choice. You were half frozen." She looked away, embarrassed or maybe just overwhelmed. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to." "No need for that," he interrupted softly. "I'm just glad you're still breathing." Silence stretched between them for a moment. She glanced at the nearby workbench, the tools neatly lined up, the calendar on the wall turned to February. Everything smelled like oil and coffee and something warm. Noah stood and walked over to a small hot plate. "I made oatmeal earlier. It's not fancy, but it's warm." She didn't answer, but when he handed her the bowl a few minutes later, she took it with shaking hands. "No name tag on you," he said casually as he returned to his seat. "You got a name?" She hesitated, then looked up at him. "Jenna." "Jenna," he repeated with a small nod. "I'm Noah." She gave a quick, polite nod, then stared down at the oatmeal like it held all the answers. The next few days passed in a quiet rhythm. Jenna didn't talk much, and Noah didn't push. He offered simple meals, grilled cheese, soup from a can, scrambled eggs. She ate without complaint, though she rarely finished a full plate. Each morning, Noah opened the garage door just a few inches to let in fresh air and check on the world outside. The snow was beginning to melt, but slowly. Town still felt far away. By the third day, Jenna was moving more easily. She limped a little when she walked, but the color had started returning to her face. She folded blankets, organized bolts on the shelves, and even swept the floor without being asked. Noah watched her, always from a quiet distance. She didn't seem used to people noticing her without asking questions, so he didn't. He simply let her be. One afternoon, she surprised him. "You've got a loose alternator on that one," she said, pointing to the old Chevy truck he'd been working on. Noah raised an eyebrow. "You know cars?" Jenna shrugged, her eyes on the floor. "A bit. My dad used to show me things when I was younger." He nodded slowly, then returned to the truck. "Well, your dad taught you right." That was all he said, but the corners of Jenna's mouth lifted just a little. Over time, a strange kind of peace filled the garage. The world outside was still cold and gray, but inside there was warmth. Not just from the heater, but from the quiet understanding that had grown between two strangers. Jenna began to smile more, though rarely with her teeth. She still flinched. When a car pulled into the driveway or when a loud noise echoed from the street, Noah noticed. One night, as the wind howled and the snow returned with fresh anger, Jenna sat near the heater, holding a cup of tea in her hands. She stared into the steam, her shoulders tense. "I ran away," she said quietly, almost to herself. Noah didn't move. "Someone powerful. Family." Her voice cracked slightly. "I can't tell you everything. Not yet." "You don't have to," Noah replied, his voice steady. Jenna looked at him surprised. "You don't owe me anything," he continued. "But if you ever feel like talking, I'll listen." Her eyes stayed on him for a long moment. Then she nodded and turned, back toward the heater. Later that night, when she thought he was asleep, Jenna opened a small notebook from her backpack. She scribbled something in the corner and then tucked it back away. Noah didn't ask what it was. The next morning, she was the first one up. She made instant coffee for them both and even handed him his usual mug without needing to be told. They didn't talk much, but in the soft, steady silence of the garage, something was healing. Not just her body, not just her fear, something deeper, something neither of them could quite name. Yet, the snow had stopped falling days ago, but the chill still hung in the air like a shadow that refused to leave. Inside the garage, though, things had changed. Jenna no longer moved like a stranger. She swept the floor without being asked. She could identify the difference between a worn spark plug and a bad alternator. She even made decent coffee. Strong, a little burnt, but drinkable. Noah had grown used to her quiet voice and the way she always checked the windows before sitting down. She was still guarded, but less so. She smiled more now. And when she thought no one was looking, she even hummed under her breath while organizing tools. But something still hung between them, an invisible weight neither had dared to name. One morning, after fixing the radiator in an old Pontiac, Noah was wiping his hands when Jenna spoke. "I think it's time I told you the truth." He looked up from the sink. She stood by the workbench, her hands resting on a folder she hadn't shown him before. "You don't have to," he said gently. "I do," she replied. "Especially before you hear it from someone else." She took a deep breath. "My name isn't just Jenna. It's Jenna Mallory." Noah blinked, the name flickering something distant in his memory. "My father," she continued, "was Samuel Mallory, chief engineer at Morrison Dynamics. You've probably heard of it." Noah's face stayed still, but his eyes hardened slightly. He had heard of Morrison Dynamics. Everyone in the industry had. "They make engine systems," she said, "but they also ruin people." Noah crossed his arms slowly. "Go on." "My uncle, my father's brother, took over the company 3 years ago. His name's Martin. When my grandfather passed, Martin convinced the board my dad wasn't mentally fit to lead, said he needed help. Rest. It wasn't true. It was all a setup." She looked down. "My dad was locked away in a private care facility. Martin took everything." Noah didn't speak, but the tension in the room thickened. "I found proof," Jenna said, tapping the folder. "Documents, emails, account transfers. He's been embezzling money for years, hiding it through fake companies. I printed what I could, but he found out. That's why I ran." She looked up at him, eyes full of fear, but also something else, something stronger. "I had nowhere to go, no one I trusted, but I remembered my dad talking about someone he worked with, someone honest. A man who used to build engines by hand. A man named Noah Weller." Noah turned slightly, walking to the garage door and peering through the small window at the gray sky outside. He said nothing for a long time. "I didn't mean to lie," she said. "I was scared, still am, but I couldn't keep running forever." Finally, Noah turned back. His voice was quiet, but firm. "I worked for Morrison Dynamics. Long time ago. Before your uncle showed up with his big ideas and cold numbers. I got let go during the efficiency phase. A Monday morning and a box full of my things." Jenna swallowed. "I'm sorry." He shook his head. "It wasn't your fault." They stood in silence, the heater buzzing softly in the corner. Then Noah stepped forward and picked up the folder. He flipped through the papers slowly, scanning each page. "This is enough to cause a storm," he said. "I know," she replied. "If something happens to me, I want you to have it. Take it to the press or a lawyer. Someone who can do something." Noah set the folder down. "That's not going to happen." Jenna raised an eyebrow. "How can you be sure?" He met her gaze. "Because you're not running anymore. You're standing." That night, Jenna sat on the couch writing in her notebook. Her fingers moved. Quickly, her face focused. Across the room, Noah sat at the workbench rebuilding a carburetor that no one had asked for. It gave his hands something to do while his mind worked through everything she'd said. He thought of his own past, the job he'd lost, the house he'd sold, the wife who couldn't bear to stay after their daughter died. It had all happened so fast. He'd been angry for years, quietly angry, until one snowy night when a stranger fell into his world and turned it upside down. The next morning, they worked side by side on a rusty red truck that had been sitting in the corner for too long. Jenna handed him tools with quiet confidence. When she reached for a wrench and fumbled, Noah caught it before it hit the ground. Their hands touched, just for a second. She looked up at him, a soft question in her eyes. "You're not a burden," he said quietly, answering what she hadn't said. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she blinked them away. "Thank you," she whispered. And for the first time since the snowstorm began, Noah smiled. Not just with his lips, but with something deeper. The morning Jenna left was colder than it had been in weeks. Frost clung to the windows and the sky was painted in soft gray and pale orange. A rental car idled quietly at the edge of the lot, its headlights glowing through the mist. Noah stood near the garage door, arms folded, watching her zip up her coat. Her bag was light, just the essentials, but her eyes were heavier than ever. "Don't know what's waiting for me out there," she said, her voice low. "Neither do I," Noah replied, his tone calm. "But I know you're not the same girl who stumbled into my garage." She nodded, then reached into her pocket and pulled out something wrapped in a soft cloth. She unfolded it and handed it to him. A hand-knitted scarf, gray with tiny flaws in the stitching. It wasn't perfect, but it was warm. "I made this after that first night. I thought maybe I'd never get to say thank you properly." Noah held the scarf in his hands, feeling its weight. "You didn't have to," he said. "I wanted to." He didn't speak for a moment. Then he looped the scarf around his neck and smiled faintly. "Looks better than motor oil." She laughed, but her smile trembled at the edges. As she climbed into the car, Jenna paused with her hand on the door. "Will you wait?" Noah met her eyes through the morning fog. "I'll be right here, like always." Then, with a small nod, she closed the door, started the engine, and pulled away. The tires crunched over gravel, leaving behind only the fading sound of the motor and a silence that pressed in gently. The days passed. Then a week. Then 2. Noah kept busy with repairs. Changed oil, swapped brake pads, replaced the clutch on a truck that hadn't moved in years. But every evening when the sun dipped behind the hills, he'd glance at the scarf folded on the workbench, waiting. Then came the day everything changed. It started with a news alert on the shop's tiny radio. Breaking. Morrison Dynamics scandal rocks boardroom as evidence of financial fraud surfaces. Whistleblower identified as Jenna Mallory. Noah stopped in the middle of tightening a bolt. He turned the volume up. The report played out like a story he already knew. Jenna had walked onto the stage of a crowded press conference and laid out the truth. Her uncle's lies, the company's corruption, and the real reason her father had been pushed aside. And she had proof. Clear, undeniable proof. Noah sat down slowly, wiping his hands on a towel as the reporters described how Jenna had brought it all to light. Calm, brave, and determined. She credits an unnamed mechanic from Maple Hill for giving her the courage to come forward, the reporter said. Someone who, in her words, reminded her what it meant to be safe. Noah didn't say anything. He just looked out the window as the sky began to darken. That night, he left the garage door unlocked. A month passed. Spring came early. The snow melted and little patches of green started peeking through the ground. The air smelled like earth and engine grease. Noah had repainted the shop door and even fixed the broken heater near the back. He didn't expect her to return. But one afternoon, he heard the sound of footsteps on gravel. He looked up, and there she was. Jenna. She stood near the old bench just outside the office, wearing a navy blue jacket and boots that didn't look borrowed anymore. She looked stronger, more certain. But her eyes were the same, steady, thoughtful, kind. "Thought you might be here," Noah said, setting down his wrench. "I said I'd come back," she replied. "I'm glad you did." They stood in silence for a moment, letting the breeze pass between them. Then she grinned. "That old Mustang still sitting in the back?" Noah chuckled. "Still waiting." They walked into the garage, and soon, the familiar clink of tools and soft laughter filled the space once again. Side by side, they worked on the engine, passing wrenches and sharing stories. At one point, Jenna dropped a bolt and laughed when it rolled under the lift. "You never stop learning," Noah said. "Even when you think you already know," she added. By sunset, they sat side by side against the wall, listening to the soft hum of the Mustang's engine. "I'm starting something new," Jenna said suddenly. "A workshop for girls, to teach them about cars, confidence, how to fix things, outside and in. I'm calling it the Mallory Project, for my dad." Noah nodded, quiet pride in his eyes. "And for you," she added. "You showed me what real strength looks like." Noah reached into his back pocket and handed her a folded sheet of paper. She opened it carefully. "Director?" she asked, reading the heading. "A new community center. Funded by the Edison Foundation," he said. "They're naming it after your dad, and they want you to run it." Tears welled up in Jenna's eyes. "He'd be proud." "So will they," Noah said. "Of you." That evening, Jenna left the garage with a promise to return in the morning, and Noah stood near the workbench, placing a photo beside one of an old memory. It was Jenna, smiling beside the Mustang, grease on her cheek, and light in her eyes. Noah looked at the picture for a long time. Then, with a quiet breath, he whispered, "Some people come into your life not to change who you are, but to remind you of who you were when you still believed in kindness." And for the first time in years, Noah Weller smiled.